The eviction notice curled at the edges on his counter, as though the paper itself had grown tired of waiting. He had 2 weeks, maybe less, and a ledger full of debt. Then the letter arrived, official seal, brittle formality, an inheritance from a distant relative he barely remembered, a single storage unit, number 307. The neighbors joked that he had inherited junk. At the auction yard, some laughed openly. He felt it anyway. The weight of the purchase pressed on him far heavier than any price tag. This was not a locker. It was a vessel of hope waiting to be claimed. For years he had read the world through surfaces, brass that had gone dull yet held a ghostly glow beneath corrosion, oak that had drunk smoke and grief yet refused to warp. He knew patina like some people knew faces, and for a long time that gift had paid the bills. Then sales slowed, rents rose, and collectors learned to chase trends on their phones. His shop sign faded in the sun. The air inside grew heavy with silence. Still, when he said he dealt in inheritances, stories that outlast currency, his voice did not waver. Unit 307 tugged at him the way certain objects do when instinct speaks louder than spreadsheets. He told himself it was irrational. He had no margin for whim, no cushion for mistakes. Yet as he signed the acceptance and found the cold key pressed into his palm, unease coiled beneath his determination. He felt a strange pull. The facility crouched at the edge of town, rows of corrugated doors like gray eyelids half closed against memory. The asphalt had split and sprouted weeds. A chemical sweetness clung to the air, the way old cardboard breathes out after long summers. Rust dripped from bolts like dried blood. Forgotten dreams had settled here and learned to stop knocking. He walked the corridor, counting in his head as though the rhythm could steady him. 301, 303, 305. When he reached 307, the lock hung stiff, powdery with age. The manager's bolt cutters bit through with a dull snap. The scent met him first. Aged wood, linen, dust, a faint tang of oil paint that had slept for decades. The door rolled up, groaning like an old hinge, and a dull rectangle of light slid over the threshold. Not junk, not even close. The interior was deliberate. Wooden racks hewn from planks in the days when joiners still argued about dovetails. Cloth-wrapped slabs leaned in careful stacks, their corners padded with faded quilts. Cylindrical containers sat upright in milk crates, each labeled in a precise hand he could feel even before he could read it. There were boxes with twine tied as though someone had wanted to teach the knot to hold a lifetime. He stood still, listening to his breath. No toppled lamps, no broken plastic, no panicked tangle of cheap furniture, no frantic stuffing. This had been assembled by someone who understood preservation and believed time was an ally. He reached out and touched the edge of the nearest bundle. The fabric was soft with age, faintly sweet, as if a long-closed parlor had exhaled. Across the back wall, a single word repeated in pencil above each rack. Keep. The handwriting was steady, almost ceremonial. He did not move further yet. He let the room speak. He had bought a ruin, yes, but he had also bought its secrets. He chose a parcel that felt like a threshold, neither smallest nor largest. The knot resisted, then yielded with the gentleness of a habit. Linen fell away, and the frame beneath was heavy, the kind produced when woodworkers believed weight meant worth. He rotated it slowly, easing it upright against his knee. The canvas surface caught the corridor light and turned it richer, as though the pigments had learned to drink darkness and give back warmth. At first, he saw only color. Deep umber skin lit from within, cobalt shadows coiling around shoulders, a shawl rendered in strokes the thickness of breath. Then the hands reached him, hands that had laid brick, hands that had braided hair, hands that had curled into fists and then opened again. The face looked out and did not defer. The mouth angled toward a smile but withheld it. Not a portrait as flattery, but a declaration. He stepped closer. The brushwork told the story of a painter who refused to apologize for confidence. He recognized the cadence before the name. He had held reproductions, copies that could never quite catch the way oil seems to lift and rest in the same motion. He had taught himself the signatures of an era with no room reserved on museum walls. Here it was, in graphite on the margin, where older artists had sometimes signed to dodge dealers meddling. He read it, felt the ground tilt, read it again. A forgotten black Renaissance artist whose few authenticated works had survived as rumor and grainy catalog images had lived in this canvas. The name tasted of coffee and night labor, of rent overdue and afternoons spent in borrowed studios. He said the name aloud. It hung in the stale light like a bell note. He had chased echoes of this hand for years. He had never expected to feel the paint ridges with his fingers. His breath shortened. He looked at the corners. The stretcher bars were custom. The back bore a faint stamp from a Harlem supplier that no longer existed. The tacking was meticulous. In the lower right, a small annotation, Spring Salon, not accepted. He closed his eyes for a moment. Rejection as proof. He opened them and saw more. Wrapped against the left wall, a taller piece. To the right, a narrow canvas shaped like a doorway. Rows that might be sketches, crates with the word fragile written and corrected to fragile. He cut another nut. Beneath the cloth, a landscape of rooftops under winter light. Laundry lines braided like notes across tenement air. People in windows. The child with a paper crown on a stoop. Not nostalgia. Witness. The air grew heavy, as though the earth itself held its breath. This was not a storage unit. This was an archive. He felt it the way a person feels weather turning. He realized too late he had not closed the door. He turned and pulled it down to a shoulder-height slit, enough to keep the corridor's noise out and let the notion of privacy in. His hands trembled. He set the two works side by side, not touching. He wiped his palms on his jeans, then laughed once without humor, then steadied. He traced the penciled inventory marks on the crate tops, initials repeated, a looping M paired with a sharp S. Beneath a stack of wrapped boards, a folder. Thin onion skin paper with carbon copies, lists, dates, exhibitions that never happened, addresses that changed with rent. He read an entry. Soldiering on is not only about bread, it is about keeping the mirror clear. Another. Our city deserves its own eyes. He understood, with the clarity that arrives when a truth refuses to wait, that he had stepped into a life's work. He was holding the cultural weight of people who had painted against erasure. His heart insisted on inventory. His hands argued for reverence. He took out his phone with shame and photographed corners for record keeping, then put it away as though it were a rude guest. He whispered to the empty space, apology and promise braided together. He once thought a fresh start meant profit. Now it meant protection. The smell of aged paint rose like a benediction. He closed the first wrapping carefully, corners aligned, not remade. He did not yet know who had assembled this sanctuary or how the bloodline threaded back to him, but he knew the task had changed. He was no longer hunting the sale. He had become in an instant a keeper. The shift happened quietly, as though a new hinge had been fitted into his chest. Moments ago, the unit had been a chance at breathing room. Now it pressed differently. A charge, not a check. Financial salvation receded like a tide. Stewardship advanced. He felt the old shopkeeper's reflex. What is it worth? Rise and then break apart against the understanding that price would be the smallest truth here. Fear threaded through responsibility. He had handled fragile clocks, brittle quilts, daguerreotypes that seemed to hold the heat of vanished faces. None of that prepared him to hold a people's reflection. What if he misread signatures? What if careless light damaged pigment? He had no climate control, no museum cradle mounts, no insurance policy, sized for culture's bone-deep memory. He had two calloused hands and a promise forming behind his teeth. He began with names. He sat cross-legged on the concrete, the code seeping through his jeans, and opened the folder again. He read the looping M and sharp S as if they were coordinates. He whispered names into the dust-heavy air, letting them settle. Painters who had lived between rents, sculptors who welded after night shifts, printmakers who documented parades police refused to see. He wrote them on a yellow pad in his own hand, ink on paper, not just images on a screen, so that his body would learn them. Unease coiled, yet beneath it, something steady rose. He could research, he could listen, he could ask curators who had championed black art long before the market discovered it. He could keep the door rolled down to a safe slit and keep the air cool with fans and bowls of water, old tricks from the shop. He could wrap his worry in method. The emotional toll came early. He unrolled the sketch and found a study of a woman standing in a doorway, arms crossed, a bandana binding her hair. The lines were swift and sure, but beneath them, a weariness tugged at the mouth. He recognized his mother's posture after late shifts, recognized the way women hold exhaustion like a ceramic bowl and do not spill. He set the drawing down and had to stand. The air was heavy with silence. He let it have him for a moment, then returned, gentler. The unit became a sanctuary by increments. He laid moving blankets on the floor, cleared a path between stacks, positioned the folding table like an altar. He turned off the music in his pocket. He spoke less and read more. He taped craft paper over the strip of window in the roll-up door to tame the light. He added sticky notes, breathing room, check humidity, cotton gloves, until the place wore his intention like a garment. He had bought a ruin, yes, but he had also bought its secrets, and secrets require care. Each unwrapping felt like both trespass and worship. The fear of inadequacy remained, but it sharpened him. He would not be the man who rushed to turn weight into cash. He would be the man who slowed the world long enough to hear what it had tried to forget. Methodical inventory became his anchor. He numbered racks. He charted shelves. He gave each bundle a temporary name. Doorway woman, rooftop winter, until he could marry it to the penciled list. Paintings first, then works on paper, then anything that clinked rather than sighed. He kept a notebook open and a soft pencil sharper than his breath. The breath revealed itself the way dawn assembles a room. Edges first, then color, then the depth you did not know existed. Paintings ranged from small, intimate heads to canvases as tall as a doorway. Sculptures appeared in crates lined with felt, bronze torsos with surfaces rubbed by careful hands, welded figures made from reimagined tools, a torso fused from washer parts that turned labor into myth. Sketches came rolled tight in tubes and folded into portfolios. Charcoal seared into toothy paper so deeply the strokes looked wet. A cohesion emerged. Decades spoke to each other. A 192 street scene. Women in brimmed hats laughing under a tenement awning answered a 196 march where those hats had become berets and the laughter had hardened into resolve. Studio interiors, where plaster dust glittered in slanting light, sat near kitchen tables, where children did homework while a figure worked at an easel. Barbershops, church basements, pool halls, stoops, beauty salons, juke joints, union halls, black life in rooms the larger culture forgot to honor. He saw birthdays and block parties, funerals carried on shoulders, nights when the record player made the whole house feel possible. The work documented not spectacle, but continuum. Behind canvases, he found envelopes tucked like small lungs. He opened one and slid out a letter on onion-skinned paper, the typing faint and sincere. Miss S., your last study reminded me of my grandmother's hands shelling peas. I did not know paint could make me hear a kitchen. Another, in ink. We cannot get the gallery to hang you, but Manuel says to keep bringing work. He will lend the van again. Dates spanned 50 years. Postmarks crossed boroughs and then states. The correspondence mapped a network: artists, teachers, community centers, barbers who hung prints in their windows, church secretaries who booked basements for shows. Then journals, thin and thick, some with marble covers, others with cheap cardboard backs. He opened one and read, Spring, 1943. M says the museum guard followed her through every room. She laughed and counted frames she would one day replace. Another, 1951. Harlem rent climbs. Studio moves again. We hung the show in the Union Hall. 2 sold, 3 were promised. Promise is a currency that does not always spend. Later, 1968. The boys on 125th chanted and then swept glass. We painted boards with angels so nobody would forget the windows. The voice shifted between writers, but kept one mission: keep record, keep each other. He realized the collection was not accidental, not a hoarder's heap, not a dealer's opportunism. It was a single collector's lifelong, passionate mission: to gather the works that galleries ignored, to buy when possible, to accept gifts when offers were made with the words, "You will keep it safe," to trade framing for prints, to make rent for a painter with the understanding a canvas would come later, to write down the story of each object so that provenance would be more than invoice numbers. He recognized the signature at the bottom of many lists, the looping M, the sharp S. The same hand had written keep above the racks. He found a photograph album, corners cracked. Inside, images of community openings, crowded rooms where painters stood beside their work in borrowed suits, children pointing, elders nodding. In one, a woman he now recognized by brushwork grinned behind a folding table piled with pamphlets. Our neighborhood sees itself. In another, a man with the posture of a teacher gestured at a charcoal study while 3 teenagers leaned forward like parched plants. The collector appeared rarely, always at the edge, always organizing, always holding a clipboard. Monetary value kept flickering at the perimeter of his mind. He was not naive, but every new page pushed it further outward. The sum here was historical significance in the shape of a chorus. He set a bronze bust on the table and touched the cold curve of a cheekbone. He realized the dollar figure had to be a tool, not a goal. Numbers that could build climate control, hire conservators, endow a space that would keep the chorus singing together. The collection's value had shifted from profit to proof. He closed the journal gently and looked at the ceiling as though it might open into sky. Time was running out. If he left the unit as it was, heat would rise with summer. Yet everything in him resisted haste. He would finish inventory, photograph without flash, wrap with cotton, document letters, then call someone who understood both price and dignity. He had entered a cathedral built from paint and steel and paper, and he would not scatter its stones. He dialed a number he trusted, a quiet expert who had walked through his shop years ago and treated a humble G's Ben quilt like a crown. The appraiser arrived at dusk, a careful man with soft gloves and a silence that honored the work before he saw it. They raised the door to a measured height, and the appraiser stepped into the cool dim like a parishioner entering a chapel. The following minute stretched thin. The expert moved slowly, eyes narrowing at edges, noting stretcher bars, canvas weave, ground layers, the graphite hum beneath the paint. He said very little. He adjusted the angle of a bronze torso, breathed on patina, watched it take light. He lifted a journal with 2 hands as though it contained a candle flame. He checked signatures, yes, but he also checked for the signatures beneath the signatures. The cadence of a line, the wrist memory that cannot be faked. Time was running out, yet the man refused to hurry. He listened to a frame's creak, traced a thumb-smooth corner, matched the stamp from a defunct Harlem supplier to a catalog lodged somewhere in a private archive of the mind. He flipped the letter and nodded at a watermark. He peered into a tube and smiled once, briefly, at a charcoal that understood sorrow without theater. Our dealer said almost nothing, afraid a stray word might tilt the scales. He watched for flinches that would warn of fraud and for the rare stillness that meant recognition. The air was heavy with dust and the faint sweetness of long decayed linen. The appraiser finally exhaled, long and measured, and looked up. "You are guarding something rare," he said, voice low so the work would not startle. There was a pause. Then numbers entered like reluctant witnesses. Conservatively, 5 million. The words did not land like fireworks. They landed like a verdict. He felt his knees threaten to unspool. He leaned on the folding table and let the syllables settle where they needed. But the expert kept speaking, and those words mattered more. A coherent body gathered with intent. A record of black life that museums will claim they always wanted. Provenance anchored, not by invoices, but by community testimony. He gestured to a letter where a church secretary had signed for receipt. He pointed to that looping M and sharp S on every sheet. He tapped the word keep, written above the racks. Price had arrived only to prove weight. With it came pressure, a new gravity. "Ensure this yesterday," the appraiser said softly. "Control climate, restrict handling, document every page before you move anything. You are a keeper now, not a seller. That is the job." He removed his gloves, folded them, and set them down as though returning a borrowed instrument. As he left, the unit seemed to inhale and hold. The estimate echoed, yes, but the confirmation echoed louder. Unmatched importance. The weight of the purchase pressed on him far heavier still, reshaped now into responsibility with a ledger written in memory rather than cash. Word found the seams. A whisper at a backroom preview became a text with a blurred photo, became a late-night call from a blocked number. The first offer arrived wrapped in politeness, a discreet acquisition, a museum-adjacent donor with deep pockets, no need for the headache of institutions or committees. Then the language thinned, no questions asked. Wire transfer within 24 hours, 7 figures for a selection. The word selection cut like cold metal. He said no. He said it again the next day. Yet beneath his determination, unease coiled. He recognized tone the way he recognized patina. The callers used it like a pry bar. They praised his eye and suggested he could do more good by seeding the work into stable collections. They used legacy as a synonym for private vault. The corridor changed temperature. He felt watched while he cataloged. The manager mentioned someone asking about Unit 307, a man who did not blink enough. A glossy gallery left a card with embossed letters and a grin that did not involve teeth. An email arrived from a foundation whose boardroom he had only ever seen in magazines, offering a consultancy fee for curatorial guidance. That sounded like permission to dismantle a chorus and call it a duet. He adjusted his routines. He arrived at odd hours. He parked far from cameras and carried his notebook inside his jacket. He added a second lock and positioned fans like sentries. He told no one about the journals except the appraiser, and even then he kept certain names folded. Still the offers multiplied, shedding their courtesy. One suggested he was not equal to the responsibility. Another made a point of his rent arrears, recited them as if empathy, then offered relief in exchange for 3 canvases and their paperwork. He went home and sat in the dark. He heard his mother's voice cautioning against easy money, heard the scrape of his shop's door when it stuck in winter, felt the same stubbornness that had kept him open through lean months rise like a spine. He was one man with a ledger and a key and a promise forming behind his teeth. Across town, unaware of the danger, curators were drafting wish lists. Investors were pre-writing press releases. Here, The air was heavy with silence and with a decision. A knock rattled the roll-up door before he reached for it. He kept the slit narrow. Two men in soft woolen hard smiles stood in the fluorescent hum. They represented a collector who preferred to remain unnamed. They admired his commitment. They could lighten his burden. He felt the corridor tilt toward threat. He said the unit was closed. They let their eyes flick past his shoulder as though the word no were a curtain they might part with patience. When they left, a note remained under the door. It was a number followed by a promise of discretion assured and expedited logistics. He folded it and slid it into a journal, where absurdities go to be measured against truth. He called the appraiser and said the vultures were circling. The man's voice tightened. That means you are doing something right. Still, the isolation thickened. He did not tell friends. He did not want to teach anyone to covet. He did not tell the manager more than necessary. He checked the door twice at night. He woke to phantom sounds, a dolly's rattle, a lock's cough. He dreamed of a rolled canvas sliding into a crate and away from its neighbors, its voice, its context. He wrote keep on a fresh strip of tape and stuck it above his own heart with a safety pin. The storage unit no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a target. He found steadiness in the journals. Promise is a currency that does not always spend, one had warned, but covenant is different. He moved through the stacks and spoke covenant under his breath. When an email offered to select a representative cross-section, he replied with a single sentence. The collection will not be scattered. Pressure redirected. A rumor suggested a lien might appear. A stranger lingered by 305 too long. A curator he respected left a message almost whispering, urging him to consider institutional protection before the market forced his hand. He heard urgency without predation in that voice, and he saved that number for morning. He locked the door and felt the corrugation vibrate against his palm like a drum. He understood the next act would require allies. He also understood the first act of any ally would be to honor the word that had built this room. Keep. The claim arrived not as a knock, but as a chorus of names on letterhead. The distant relatives' children surfaced from the past with practiced certainty, asserting that Unit 307 and everything inside was family property, not his. Their email was careful, its politeness cut to a razor. They questioned chain of inheritance, suggested a clerical oversight, and implied he had exploited grief to seize what was not his. He read it twice, then a third time, hearing the subtext. We see money. We smell leverage. Return it. They followed the paper with bodies. Two siblings, crisp clothes, voices sharpened by entitlement, stood at the threshold when he lifted the door to its narrow slit. They offered condolences wrapped around a demand. The man spoke numbers. The woman spoke principle. Together they spoke as though blood alone conferred stewardship. He listened, shoulders squared under the corrugated gloom, and felt an old ache. How easily legacy can be translated into currency by those who did not carry it. You inherited access, the brother said, not ownership. Our aunt meant for everyone to benefit. The syllables of benefit sounded like liquidation. He kept his voice measured. Your aunt named the unit. She named me. The paperwork is clean. The woman glanced past him as if the art might step forward and present its own passport. We will contest, she said. Courts tend to favor direct family when cultural assets are involved. He heard the phrase cultural assets and felt his jaw tighten. He thought of the journals, calling the work a chorus, and understood why an audience can become a jury without ever learning to listen. They tried empathy next. We know your shop is failing. We know the vultures have called. You should not carry this burden alone. Let us relieve you. The words relief and remove leaned on each other like accomplices. He thanked them for their concern and told them the unit was closed. The brother's smile flattened. He promised lawyers. He promised an injunction. He promised a future in which the art would be responsibly monetized, so that everyone could share in the uplift. That night, paper arrived on his phone, dense with paragraphs, elegant with menace. Temporary restraining orders sought. Allegations of opportunism spelled out in a tone that pretended not to be accusatory. The argument was old as probate. They had a name in common with the deceased. Therefore, they had purchase on the dead woman's intention. He felt the unit's air grow thinner. He pictured the collection cleaved into thirds, hung by strangers, traded between private walls, its narrative broken into saleable fragments. The thought made his hands cold. He met them once more on neutral ground, a community center with chip paint and a good heart, so that his refusal would be witnessed by a place that remembered purpose. They arrived with a proposal polished like a showroom floor. A foundation could be created, they said, that would allow strategic divestment. He heard their careful phrase and saw crates sliding into vans. He told them the collection had a spine. Break it, and you break its meaning. The woman's eyes softened for a second, as though some distant music reached her. Then she looked at the numbers again, and the music thinned. As he left, a boy paused at the center's bulletin board and traced a flyer's letters about an after-school art class. The boy's finger moved like a pencil learning confidence. The dealer watched and understood the fear that truly drove him. Not losing money, not even losing face, but losing a hold that taught people to see themselves. The legal threat loomed, yes, but the deeper threat was piecemeal forgetting. He locked 307 and stood with his ear against the corrugation. The unit carried a hush like a held breath. He whispered, "Keep," into the seam. He knew the law would require documents, not whispers. He knew he would need to answer accusations with time-stamped letters and signed bequests. He also knew that a coarse fluorescent light could make cultural inheritance look like inventory. He needed more than paper. He needed the hand that had written "keep" above the racks to explain itself. He went hunting in the boxes that had felt like hearts. Behind a row of narrow canvases, he found a ledger different from the rest. Not sales, not shows, but kin. Names in branches, addresses, margins filled with tiny notes, birthdays, recipes, a hymn title penciled beside a name as if to hum the person into the record. He followed the looping M through generations until it reached his own surname and paused like a finger pressed thoughtfully to a lip. A cousin not cousin line. A woman who moved south and then returned north with a child. A marriage that changed the last name and hid a first. The air was heavy with dust and the faint sweetness of long decayed linen. He turned a page and a photograph slipped free. A black and white of a storefront in a borough he knew only through stories. The window filled with frames, the sidewalk filled with people who looked unhurried despite hardship. At the edge, a girl with her chin up. On the back, in a looping hand, a sentence. To the nephew who knows how to see. When it is time, you will know why. He pressed his thumb to the paper's soft bruise. The word nephew burned through him. He dug further and found letters addressed to his mother's maiden name, postmarked from a block she had refused to drive past because it held too many ghosts. Inside, a note. Tell the child with the careful hands to come by. He places a cup on a table like it is a small altar. That is how a keeper touches things. He remembered being scolded as a boy for carrying plates too solemnly. He remembered his mother laughing, then hush frowning, because sometimes you must teach a child to be ordinary for safety's sake. He remembered how the urge to protect and the urge to honor had always wrestled in their house. The journal shifted under his hands, from inventory to confession. I have chosen someone, the collector had written, not by blood alone, but by temperament. Legacy requires stamina. It requires a person who can live with hunger and not eat the bread meant for the museum of tomorrow. He read that twice and felt both accused and blessed. He had been hungry for months. He had not eaten the bread. He had waited for something he could not name, and now that something had a name, he could not refuse. Time was running out. The lawyers would not care that the collector had watched him as a boy arrange teaspoons into constellations. Courts preferred notarized intent to prophetic sentences. Yet the discovery soldered a seam inside him. This was not random. This was not luck. It was instinct, that quiet voice inside that occasionally steers a man toward destiny. The burden transformed in his hands. It became sacred duty, not in a theatrical way, but in the way a key feels specific to a lock. He saw the lineage of preservation, the woman who had taped keep above the racks, the man who welded bodies out of washed metal, the choir of artists who had painted themselves into visibility, the boy at the bulletin board learning to shape letters, his own mother teaching him to place a cup without rattling it, a chain, unbroken because someone kept reaching back. He set the photograph of the storefront beside the ledger and tried to imagine an argument that could pry him away from this purpose. Money blinked in and out like a far signal. Safety murmured. Weariness stacked itself like boxes, yet beneath them all ran a current. Covenant. He wrote the word on a card and taped it beside keep. He would bring their journals to any courtroom that would let him carry them. He would speak their names in rooms where names turn into exhibits. He would not be alone. He would find those who had known the collector's hand and ask them to testify not only to ownership, but to mission. He folded the photograph back into its envelope and felt steadier than any appraisal could make him. The external threats had not shrunk. They had clarified him. Across town, attorneys were drafting motions. Here, he put on cotton gloves and reached for another wrapped canvas, because the best way to defend a chorus was to keep cataloging its voices. The courtroom air held that polished stillness that makes voices sound smaller than they feel. He sat beside counsel who had agreed to work lean because she loved art that told the truth. Across the aisle, the distant relatives' children arranged their papers like bayonets. The judge read the caption, then lifted her eyes with a patience that suggested she understood how inheritance can fracture a room. Opening statements divided motive from mission. Their attorney sketched the arc simply: a valid bequest of a single storage unit, a collection assembled with intent, journals that revealed a covenant to keep the body whole. The opposition called it inventory. They emphasized bloodline as if biology were the only language legacy understands. They framed him as opportunist, a shopkeeper surfing a wave of grief. He kept his gaze steady and placed one palm on the notebook that held the looping M and sharp S. Evidence for them began with the paperwork: the lease transfer, the notarized letter of inheritance, the appraiser's affidavit establishing significance and value. Then came the journals, not read as poetry but as proof: dates, exhibition lists, purchase notes that said paid in full or promised in exchange for framing, fulfilled. Counsel held them like scripture and quoted sparingly, a sentence at a time. Keep, covenant. Our neighborhood sees itself. Witnesses altered the room's temperature. The trusted appraiser testified first, clinical yet reverent. He spoke of coherence, of how meaning multiplies when kept intact. He explained that cultural value is not the sum of sale prices, but the integrity of a chorus. He did not romanticize. He anchored his assessment with stamps, watermarks, stretcher types. Opposing counsel tried to bait him into speculating auction totals. He declined, returning to the phrase, conservatively, $5 million, only as context for risk. A museum educator took the stand, a woman who had built programs in church basements before museums learned to pay attention. She testified about erasure, about artists who had hung shows in union halls when galleries closed their doors. She described what a contiguous collection offers students, not masterpieces isolated like rare birds, but a habitat alive with interdependence. The opposition asked if students could not learn from individual works elsewhere. She answered with a quiet, they can learn, but they cannot remember as a people. Then he testified. His voice did not seek theater. He described the door lifting, the smell of oil and linen, the repeated word written above the racks. He told the story of the letters tucked behind canvases and the photograph of the storefront inscribed, "To the nephew who knows how to see." He did not claim perfection. He confessed fear. He admitted he could sell and sleep easier for a season. He said the weight of the purchase pressed on him far heavier than any price tag because a community had been preserved inside. The judge watched him the way people watch someone tell the truth without flourish. Opposing counsel cross-examined with the scalpel. They pressed debt. They counted bills. They proposed a world in which strategic divestment funded scholarships that would honor the artist better than dust. They implied that stewardship and poverty cannot share a house. He felt heat crawl his neck. Then he answered with the sentence he had written on a card. The collection is a spine. Fracture it, and you sever its nerves. He spoke of journals as bones, letters as tendons, sculptures as muscle, paintings as breath. The courtroom blinked. The metaphor held. Finally, they called a historian of black art whose work predated trend. He traced names across decades, naming the artists whose signature had made the air tilt, verifying that the hand belonged to a painter museums now work to rediscover. He pointed to the welded torsos as descendants of labor turned into myth. He said the truth was worse than erasure. It was dispersion. He looked at the judge and said, with no drama, that if this body breaks, the record will bleed out. The opposition returned to bloodline. They spoke of filial piety and estates. They reminded the court that money could build wings on museums. They called the collection an asset again, as if the word could domesticate it. He watched the judge's pen pause each time they reduced a life's work to columns. Closing arguments arrived like weather. His counsel chose the narrow road. Lawful bequest, clear intent, public interest. She did not sermonize. She ended with 3 words from the wall. Keep, whole, accessible. The ruling came with morning light angled through the tall windows. The judge's voice carried neither triumph nor rebuke, only a measured clarity that sounded like the law remembering its better self. The court affirms the validity of the bequest, she said. The storage unit and its contents passed to the respondent. She acknowledged the collection's cultural significance, urged collaboration with institutions, and cautioned against haste. She said stewardship, not speculation, would guide any further petitions before her bench. Breath left him like a tide returning the sea. There was no applause, just the small sounds of paper being gathered by people recalculating futures. Across the aisle, the siblings conferred in whispers that sounded like the soft tearing of tape. He did not gloat. He felt the ledger of responsibility add a new column. You won the right to carry it. Outside, the air smelled of rain on warm stone. His attorney pressed his hand once, more vow than congratulation. He stood for a while in the courthouse steps' wide hush, letting relief drain without taking his edge. The vultures would not vanish. They would circle higher, learning the new thermals. He needed to decide who he was now that a judge had said keeper. 2 paths arranged themselves. One offered quick freedom. Sell 5 pieces discreetly, retire the rent, pay down debt, move the rest into storage with better climate, call it a bridge. The other offered a longer road. Establish a trust, endow preservation, choose a home that would accept conditions written in stern ink. He closed his eyes and saw the word keep above the racks, the photograph inscribed to the nephew, the boy at the bulletin board tracing letters. He chose difficulty. He met with counsel and an accountant who treated art like breath. Together they drafted a trust whose first line braided purpose and protection. The collection shall remain whole. He wrote clauses that forbade sale except in catastrophic preservation emergencies, that required free days for neighborhood schools, that mandated the journals be digitized and housed where anyone could search a name and find a life. He contacted institutions that had practiced respect before press releases. He asked for partnership, not custody. A small museum agreed to host an exhibition under the trust terms while a permanent home was prepared. He returned to 307 with signed papers that felt like armor. The unit's cool dim welcomed him as though the racks could recognize his intention. He read aloud the trust's first line to the empty air. He felt odd doing it, then less odd, then right. He placed copies of the trust among the journals so that future keepers would not have to guess at his spine. He did not become wealthy. He did not become comfortable. He became purposeful. Grants required language, and he learned to translate covenant into proposals. Volunteers arrived with cotton gloves. Conservators taught him humidity like weather. Children visited and pointed at the boy in the paper crown. Elders stood before the welded torso and nodded as if greeting a cousin. He watched as faces found themselves. The final image stayed with him. The word keep, faded pencil, above racks transformed into museum labels, the looping M and sharp S reproduced on a wall as signature of a life's mission. What he chose to do next would matter. Subscribe for more uncanny, remarkable stories. The gallery lights were gentle, the air held steady, and the chorus hung whole. Children traced lines with their eyes. Elders whispered names that returned like rain. He stood at the edge, anonymous and content, the trust's first line etched on the wall beside keep. His life had altered in quieter ways. Less sleep, more purpose. Fewer invoices, more invitations. The weight remained, but it steadied him. He touched the locket of keys, felt the hum of an inheritance, safeguarded, and breathed. The final painting caught the room's light and gave it back. What he chose to do next would matter. Subscribe for more uncanny, remarkable stories.